Hello, Parker. Welcome to the Rural Opportunities Podcast.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it.
So we're going to be talking about buying rural properties today. And you've been a realtor for a while now. And I actually am curious. I've known you for a while, but I don't actually know why you got into real estate. So I'm just going to give you a chance to talk about yourself and why you love it and how you got into it and that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, appreciate you having me on. In terms of how I got into real estate, so do you remember I was running that scrap metal business before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the middle of I was running an auto recycling company. I recycled catalytic converters and batteries and aluminum rims and all sorts of stuff. And in that business from about 2010 to 2014, I just inherently wanted to purchase a house. It's not like I wanted to get into real estate in the sense that I am now, but I bought a house with a buddy of mine in 2012, and we ended up renting out the rooms to our buddies, and that buddy who I bought the house with, he ended up buying me out of that house, which I then used to buy an acreage and get onto a rural property when my wife and I got married. But through that recycling company, we winded it down in 2015 and 2016. And at that point, I had seen the potential money that we had made in that first house and getting onto an acreage. I was like, this is awesome. Like long term, I think real estate can be a great financial vehicle for people, especially from the investment side. And so a couple things kind of drew me to it. Was from the investment side, I want to work with some investors, but also I kind of grew up on an acreage, and then we had purchased an acreage. And so I was like, if I can help other people do this, that would be awesome. So I was in 2016, and yeah, so I've been at it ever since. And I mean, part of why I just love it is because I get to have coffee with people and help them get into the place where they want to live, whether it be their first financial stepping stone and be there for a few years, or end up being there forever home. The whole process is just super fun. So
that's a really cool story, actually. So real estate has been a pretty hot topic this year. Is it still a hot market out there? Do you think it's slowing down? What is it looking like?
All in all, it is still a very hot topic. I mean, I heard I heard some investment advice one time from this like billionaire investor. Once your taxi driver or your barber is talking about that particular asset class, you know that you may have missed the boat. But that being said, real estate long term has always been a really good hedge against inflation, and has always been one of the safest assets to hold in terms of like a track record over hundreds of years. So it has been hot over the last year, especially. I mean, I think that has a couple different factors. One, kind of to give you a timeline through COVID, March and April of 2020, things obviously shut down, as you can imagine. April, there was almost no transactions compared to the April previous. So it had dropped about 70%, at least this is for the Alberta market, 70% over year from April 2019 to April 2020. And then once you got into May and June, and COVID wasn't quite the craziness that everybody thought it was going to be, you kind of saw it started to pick back up. But by the time July, August, and September of 2020 came around, you had people sitting in their houses that were looking online at houses and looking at getting out of their condos. I mean, that was a big one. People that were in condos wanted to get out of condos because they didn't want to be near people anymore.
Right, have some space.
Yeah, and then so you kind of saw this natural progression of people who were in condos wanted to get into half duplexes or single family homes. People who were in single family homes that were small, that were forced to lock down with their spouse or brother, sister, whatever, they were like, we need to get into a bigger house. And so they would move up in house. And you saw a lot of people that were in houses that really did want to live in the country, or the next step of getting away from people, they were like, we got to get into the country. And
Yes.
so the only people holding the bag were condo owners. And that's still kind of the case. But in terms of single family houses in the city and in smaller towns and acreages are generally moving pretty well still. And that seems to be, at least from a Canadian economic standpoint, looking forward into 2022, what's going to continue. And we can dive into that a little more if you want, but that's the general trend for sure.
Interesting. So when you were talking about properties as an investment and a pretty good hedge against inflation, with prices for houses going crazy, is that still true?
So I think in smaller markets like Alberta, I'm just going to generalize and call Alberta a smaller market compared to the Vancouvers and Torontos of the world. I think that in the prairie provinces, you're still pretty safe in terms of affordability is still there overall. In terms of your average annual income in Alberta for a household is between $100,000 and $120,000, depending where you are, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And your average property is anywhere from 300 to 400, just depending what market. So when you look at those numbers of annual income of 100,000 for a household, and the average purchase price of say 350, that's pretty affordable in terms of where you look at in different provinces. Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba are pretty affordable. So I think there is quite a lot of room to grow there still, and we don't have to be concerned about a major drop in the market or anything like that.
Okay, that's good to know. Interesting. So in terms of rural properties, what are the main things that you need to look at when you're looking at a rural property, and what are some of the red flags?
Sure. So yeah, growing up on an acreage, and then when we got married and we bought an acreage outside of Sherwood Park, that's definitely some things that we firsthand wanted to look at. And now as a realtor, it's kind of expanded my vision even more. So there are certain things that translate from houses in towns or in cities to acreages, but there's certain things that you have to watch out for. One of those things that are dependent is you'll see in a lot of areas in Alberta for sure where you'll have cisterns, so where your water is stored, like Strathcona County outside of Sherwood Park, for example, 90+% are cisterns. You barely have any wells at all.
Okay, and so with a cistern, that means you're hauling water in, right?
Correct. So you generally get your water hauled in once a month. If you have a water truck or access to a water truck, you could do it yourself for a little cheaper, but there's services that will haul your water in for you every 3 to 6 weeks type thing. And so that's just an extra cost that you have to calculate in. In towns, you have your water, sewer, garbage cost. It's kind of the same with the cistern. You have, depending on the size of family, really anywhere from 80 to $200 a month that you're going to be spending in water if you have a cistern. So that's something to pay attention to, because if you have a well, that's just a cost that you don't necessarily have to think about. If it's already in, if it's a good producing well, and we can dive into that too, then that's something you don't have to think about. But if you are looking at rural properties, that's something to take note of. Does it have a well or does it have a cistern?
Right, and you can pull the Alberta water well reports for that.
Yeah.
Say there is a well on a property, but it is kind of sketchy. Like, is there a lot of times where you're drilling a new well possibly, or can they be salvaged?
Yeah, if you have a well that is pumping like 1 gallon a minute. So for people who aren't familiar, the general standard or the measure that you use is gallons per minute. How many gallons per minute does it pump? If you have a well that's pumping 1 gallon per minute, I mean, that's typically what you'll see for feeding livestock type thing. Even a couple of gallons a minute is probably fine for like a couple with no kids if you're using the dishwasher and maybe the shower at the same time, but that's about it.
Good.
But there are plenty of wells that will do 5, 10, 15 gallons per minute. So 15 gallons a minute is a super healthy number that you will see quite regular. But if you do have a well that's only doing a gallon or two per minute, it's something you have to think about is, okay, we might have to drill a new well, because at least I don't know of anyone who has tried to salvage or get their well to produce more. Now, I mean, you can have like a pressure tank, I guess, that can help with that you can fill up the water in that tank, and it helps with that a little bit. But generally, you're going to think about drilling a new well. So.
All right. And another thing that people might find on older farms or acreages is a well pit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I'm not actually super familiar with well pits, but yeah, I mean, it's generally something that I try and stay away from because if you have a well pit, then you're going to be probably, like, I would advise just to look at drilling a new well anyway. So if that's something that you're looking at, I mean, just be wary that you're going to have to do some research and make sure that you can take that on if you're willing to. But at least in my experience there, and from older realtors that I've dealt with as well, they're like, yeah, you may as well just tell them to look for a different property, or if they're willing to, if they love that specific property, look at drilling a new well. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from the little I know about well pits, it's basically just a hazard. Like it's a big hole.
Yep. Yeah. And yeah, that's the other thing is if you have young kids or something, I mean, you want to make sure that they're covered up. That's like if you see in the movies, like the piece of plywood or the piece of boards that are covering over that pit and somebody falls in. It is a real hazard for young kids. That's something else. So
yeah, absolutely.
Again, something to keep in mind. I would just advise like close it off completely and think about drilling a new well. So
yeah, exactly. So water is a big thing when you're buying a property, especially if you want to have livestock or something. So that's a good thing to look out for. Okay, so something else on an acreage that you need to look at is the septic systems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, when you are looking at country residential properties, that's how it's zoned in Alberta, if you will. There are extra conditions that you can actually put in the deal. So when you're in town, you just kind of have your regular property inspection and financing condition. When you're buying an acreage, you can actually have extra conditions like testing the septic is a condition all on its own. And testing the water is like a water test is another one. So if you have a cistern, obviously it's just going to be that county or town or city's water. But if it's a well, you can actually test that water to see how it is. Septic, same thing. So there's a few different forms of septic systems, if you will. In older properties, you'll have a septic tank, and usually it's a 2-tank system. So you'll have one tank that holds the solids, and then usually there's a I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but basically a hose type thing that goes through, and your liquids will go in there, and then that gets pumped out. In older properties, that's often just a straight pump out. That's not legal anymore. However, that being said, if that's how it is on the property, it's essentially grandfathered, that if you don't change anything, you can keep operating it that way. So with that, you still need to get that septic tank with the solids pumped out depending on the size of the tank, every 12 to 24 months type thing. Then you will also have a system where similar in the sense that there's 2 tanks, but you will have like a field, so a septic tank and field. You've probably heard that term before. So the liquids will just go into a field that's under the dirt, and it generally just decomposes and goes into the earth, and not a big deal. Another one is a septic tank and mound, where there's a mound that's physically built. You'll see it on the property somewhere that to the untrained eye, it just looks like a hill. But that is where the septic is underneath there. So same kind of thing. Usually there's a tank associated with that that will have to get pumped out. And then you have a super fancy system that costs tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars. That I'm actually, the phrase is escaping me right now, but it's a 4-chamber system instead of a 2. That is a lot more complicated, but essentially it gets installed and you have no maintenance.
Right.
But I mean, I just sold an acreage for $950,000 that had one of those. That I know they spent like $90,000 to install it or something. So yeah, septic is something you got to watch for in terms of age. Often you'll have like an acreage from the 70s or 80s where the septic was installed, and it's original from the 70s or 80s. With the tank itself, usually they're made of concrete. And so over time, concrete in Alberta especially seems to decompose with the freeze and thaw of our climate. So generally septic tanks will last for 30 to 50 years. It can really be anywhere in that range. So if you're looking at an acreage from 1990 or before, chances are you should budget for replacing that at some point.
Right.
So depending on the septic system, I mean, it can be anywhere from 12 to 90, $100,000, just depending how fancy you get. But plan for 15 to 20 grand for sure.
Right. And if you're moving from the city and you've never had to deal with sewage, like if you have a septic tank, you're probably going to have to get what we always called the honey truck to come and suck out your septic tank every once in a while.
Yep.
And I've also heard stories of people flushing stuff down the toilet that, like, it doesn't go away once you flush it. Like, it goes into your septic tank. It's not just down the city pipe and wherever it goes in the city, I don't even know. So whatever you're flushing down the toilet, you're probably going to have to deal with later at some point. So that's something for people to keep in mind if they're not used to that.
Yes, and especially I'll just take a quick note on if you do have an older septic system, and some of the concrete, especially by the cap, so you have a big septic tank lid. If some of the concrete by that lid is starting to break down and crumble, then you're going to get some sewage smell seeping out.
Right.
So anytime you walk by, like usually your septic tank lid is accessible because a truck has to back into your property and get access to it. So, I mean, it's going to be somewhere where you're walking by fairly normal if you're using your yard at all. So just be mindful of that you're going to have some septic smell if that lid is starting to break down.
Right. And we're talking pretty general about septic and wells, which are a pretty big topic. So I do know that most counties will put on sewer workshops and a water well workshop every year, and they'll actually pull your water well report and help you go through that. So check out the counties when they're going to do that. It's usually in the fall, I think, so people can check that out if they're interested. Is there any other major things that people should look for on a property?
Let me think. I would say acreages are just a different can of worms than when you're in town. Like, for example, the acres that we first bought outside of Sherwood Park, it had a cinder block foundation for the main house. And cinder block foundations are fairly common for 40s and 50s places in Alberta, especially in acreages. 40s and 50s houses in the city are pretty much always concrete poured foundation, but on acreages there's often cinder block, which just gives more chance for failure because it has the grout, I think that's the right term. It has the grout on every single block that your potential for crack and leakage is just a lot higher as the block. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is you'll have some pressure treated wood foundations on acreages. So it was a big thing in like the 70s, especially early 80s. And so yeah, it's just something that you need to watch out for, because for whatever reason, people thought that it would be a good idea to put a foundation with pressure treated wood. There are some that still hold up. I just sold one that had a pressure treated wood foundation, but part of the property inspection was the property inspector was fairly familiar with pressure treated wood foundations, and he recommended getting an engineer to come sign off, because especially around the windows, you'll have the potential for more rot and breaking down. So essentially an engineer had to come in and just re-brace around each of the windows to make sure that it was good for the bank to sign off for their appraisal. Because obviously that's disclosed to the bank that what kind of foundation is it. 99 times out of 100, you're going to have a concrete foundation, but in acreages, you have a pretty good chance for cinder block if it's 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, you might have pressure treated wood. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. One other thing is just size of land. I mean, if you're moving to an acreage, how much land do you want? And there's no wrong answer, but some people want 1 acre, some people want a quarter section at 160. Some people are okay with 3 to 5. Like you'll have a lot of subdivisions in Alberta that have 3-acre parcels, 5-acre parcels. So yeah, that's pretty common. One other thing that I'll touch on is if you are running a small business out of your acreage, which a lot of self-employed or entrepreneurial people will want to do. Now, I'm not an accountant or a tax advisor. Consult your professional for that. However, that being said, if you're running a small business on your acreage, chances are there's going to be some taxes / GST involved if you go to sell your house.
Okay.
So that's something that you need to talk to your accountant about. Something else is if it's 10 acres or over, doesn't matter what kind of use of land, if it's your primary residence, often there can be GST implications if it's over 10 acres. So the bank will often come and appraise the property on the house, and I've even heard 5 acres sometimes lately.
Right.
So the bank will come and appraise the house in 5 acres or the house in 10 acres, but then anything over that is treated as vacant land and potentially taxable. So
Interesting.
just
I
some
didn't know
things
that.
you got to watch out for. So don't take my word for it, but doing this every week in and week out, I've had some clients be less than impressed when I go and tell them to talk to their accountant, and their accountant tells them there's GST implications. So
Right. Also, if you are running a small business, internet sometimes is an issue. So if that's what you're planning on doing, check out the internet service in your area, because sometimes it's not the best.
Yeah. In the biggest ones in central Alberta for sure is you have a lot of ExploreNet or MCSNet are the two kind of biggest options, and some people love them, some people hate them, some people stick huge towers on top of their houses so they can get extra reception.
Yeah.
So all sorts of stuff.
I've heard a few people who are trying out Starlink, and so far are very happy with it. So that could be another option out there.
Yeah, that is, and I think it depends where you are, but I've heard nothing but good things so far.
Yeah. One question that I had, when someone found out that I was talking to you, they were asking about the rural property reports. And so I believe this is from the county. Is this something that the realtors pull? Is this something that people should be looking at?
So
I don't really know about it. So can you?
Part of, so it's called a real property report.
Okay.
So short term, you'll often hear realtors or lawyers talk about as RPRs, real property report. Essentially that's just a surveying company that comes and does a survey of the land. It's just like an overhead shot that shows the house, shows any detached garage, shows any fences or fence lines. It shows like outbuildings like sheds or shops or anything like that, stables, whatever. And then it will also show the property lines itself. So yeah, we're getting into the weeds, but it's good. So if you're going to purchase an acreage or sell your acreage, it is standard for the Alberta Real Estate Association, for the Alberta Real Estate Contract, to have a real property report with the sale. So as a seller, you are supposed to provide a real property report to the buyer. They are, like I said, from a surveying company, but there's also a letter of compliance from the county or the city to go along with it. So let's say you're buying in Camrose County. I just did one just south of Camrose that the seller didn't have a real property report, but the buyer really pushed to have one because they wanted to know exactly where the boundaries of the property was. It was about 7 acres, and they had a house and a double detached garage and a couple sheds, outbuildings, and a stable for their horses. So they went to get the real property report. The surveying company came and did it, and then when they went to apply for compliance with Camrose County, according to the Camrose County bylaws, their garage was too close to the property line, according to the bylaws. So essentially, as the selling agent, I listed it, and another realtor brought the buyer. I just fought for my seller to say, hey, listen, we provided them the real property report. Everything complies on the property, the house, the outbuildings, the garage itself is fine. You pulled permits to build it and all of that. But let's fight for them to just accept it as it is. So essentially we got them to accept the garage where it was, and it turned out fine. But often you'll have a bickering back and forth after it's considered sold and you're within the last few days before possession, and the lawyers are fighting back and forth about who's going to pay for what, or if there's no permits pulled, and there's a lot of stuff that can happen in those last couple of days. So as an overarching view, a real property report is expected to go with a sale. But if you don't have it for whatever reason, there is another way that you can do that. You can reach out to me if you want to talk about that or not. So
Okay, interesting. So I'm curious. So the person who bought that property, do they have to do something about the garage because it's not?
So depending on the county, some counties are stricter than others. Camrose County essentially said that the garage is non-compliant in terms of where it sits, but the technical term is non-conforming. So they said, you can keep it there. We're not going to pursue any action against you. But if you want to make any changes to the garage, then we have the right to essentially say, no, you need to move the garage physically. So yeah, it's the technical term is non-conforming. So as long as you don't add on to it, then you're fine to leave it there. But if you add on to it, you're supposed to inform the county, and technically you should move the whole garage itself.
Okay, yeah, there is, depending on what municipality you're in, a lot of rules that goes with buildings and fences and
Yeah,
how many horses you can have, whatever.
Leduc County is the worst. Like they enforce everything. And
Which county was that, sorry?
Leduc County.
Okay.
Yeah. So just be careful if you're buying something in a real property report doesn't quite comply. You need to try and get it to comply as best as possible. Otherwise, the county might come and ding you with some fees and permit fees and all sorts of stuff.
Okay, interesting. So if somebody's looking for a real property, it doesn't technically mean they have to move out to the middle of nowhere or onto an acreage. There are smaller communities and villages and hamlets. So some of those will already have sewer and water services. So that's another option for people if they don't quite want to go to an acreage yet.
Yep.
They can be in a smaller community.
Yep.
Do you see some of those smaller communities selling or a lot of people buying there?
Yeah. So where are all your listeners from? Is it mostly Alberta or mostly central? Like, is it kind of all over the place, or is it mostly central Alberta?
I would say mostly around cameras. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, like looking at cameras or with Taskwind, or even, I mean, Leduc is a bit more mainstream because it's right off Highway 2, but cameras, things are moving pretty good. There are some houses that sit just because they're small, and the pool of buyers looking for smaller first time houses are not as big. But the houses that are appealing to families, like 3 bedrooms on the main floor, double garage type thing, those are moving fairly quickly. On the lower price point end, not as much. However, that being said, from an overarching view, comparing it to even like 2017, 2018, 2019, the days on market seem to be less now than a few years ago. So they are moving faster. Like with Taskwind, for example, the days on market historically they were from 75 to 90 days before something sells, 2.5 months to 3 months before something sells. Right now it's at about 60. So it's still, you got a couple months on average, but it's, I mean, a third faster than normal. So things are definitely busier in the smaller communities than historically.
So if somebody is thinking about selling their real property right now, it's still a good time to do that.
Acreages honestly are, acreages are busier than towns for the most part, just because there's not as much supply in Wetaskiwin and Camrose, and even some of the smaller towns like Hay Lakes and Moose Repta and stuff like that. You have a few places listed in town, and buyers have their pick of the pie. But acreages, there's not a lot of options, especially in the affordable price points. Like anything 500,000 and under generally is moving really quickly. Like for example, this one I just sold in Camrose County was 360, and we had a buyer within a few days.
Yeah, I saw that one, and then I saw it was taken off right away, and I was like, oh, that was fast.
Yeah, well, and I think it's because acreages, especially under 400, pretty much don't exist. And if they do, they sell pretty quick.
Right.
So yeah, if you are thinking of purchasing an acreage, I mean, it's good to have, not to plug, but it's good to have a realtor in your corner to be on top of it, so that you can get to the property as soon as it comes to market. Or even, I mean, I make a habit of having relationships with other realtors to know what's coming up. So that kind of thing too. But also on the selling side, if you think of selling your acreage, I mean, there are, just from a supply and demand standpoint, there's a lack of supply for affordable acreages, and there's quite a large pool of buyers because you have this trend from COVID where people are sitting at home looking on their computers, wanting to move out of town, and there's not enough affordable acreages.
So if somebody is going to list their real property, what should they look for in a realtor?
Right, that's a good question. So I hate talking about myself, and like I'm not,
you can brag a little.
I'm not the bragging kind of guy. However, that being said, having someone with a really hard work ethic is good to have. There's a lot of realtors that have been in the business a long time, and they've lost the hustle that they had when they were once young. I mean, I'm a relatively young man, and I have a long time in this career still. I love what I do, and so I think that's probably one thing, finding somebody that's passionate about what they do. Like, I love every day of my job. Sure, there's parts that are annoying, like dealing with real property reports and that kind of stuff. There's always little problems that come and go, but something else I would say is somebody who's going to communicate with you on a regular basis. Biggest feedback I hear from people, and this is crazy to me, is that when somebody buys a property and then they have a realtor that they never hear from again, or even within the deal, if something goes wrong and then the realtor won't communicate with them, I mean, that drives me bonkers. Like, I'm in an industry where you should be professional when you are dealing with your clients, and just stopping communication completely in the middle of a deal doesn't seem very professional, in my opinion.
Right. And there's a lot at stake for people, whether they're selling or buying. It's a good chunk of money. So
Yeah. So somebody who is looking at it from a financial perspective, for sure, there's often people that have bought a house, whether it's in town or out of town, that they just paid list price or close to list price because they loved it. But if they had somebody on the buying side that said, well, looking at the comparable sales around, this is actually worth $350, not $380 what you're paying. So if you were able to get a good deal on the buy side and having somebody who's in your corner for that. Something else that people don't necessarily know is you don't have to go to the listing agent that's on the sign. Like in the province of Alberta, it's free to work with a buying agent. So like I could be helping somebody look for a property on the buying side and looking at a property that's listed with somebody else. The sellers are the ones who pay for all the costs. The buyers don't have to pay for anything in the province of Alberta, aside from the property inspection and the lawyer. But from that standpoint, you can have, as a buyer, you can have someone who's acting with your best interest at heart. And then that keeps it a little cleaner on the listing side too. The listing agent can act for the best interest of their sellers. The buying agent can act for the best interest of the buyers, and it keeps it clean. It keeps it professional, I would say. So,
right. So pick someone you're comfortable with.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you have a listing agent that is also bringing the buyer, there's an inherent conflict of interest there, and things can potentially get a little messy. But anyway, so that's another thing. And then the last thing I would say is just find somebody that would be a good fit with you. Like some people will call based on marketing or advertising, but then they meet the realtor and they don't like them or they don't get along or whatever the case may be. Yeah, and I mean that's the reality. You're not going to love everyone, but I don't know. I would find somebody that you would have a good relationship with. Don't feel bad about talking to a couple different realtors or a few different realtors to get that sense first, and go from there.
Totally, that's good advice. Before I ask you if you have anything else about properties, I looked up just for fun what people who moved to the country was kind of things that they missed in the first year and things that they loved. So things that they weren't a huge fan of was the rural internet, no pizza delivery, that was the top one, and a commute. Things that they loved was that they were more self-sufficient, more space for their family, they could grow their own food, and they had solitude and they were close to nature. So those are some pretty awesome things and maybe some things to think about if you're looking for a real property.
Yep, I would agree.
Is there anything else that you would add?
Yeah, I would ask yourself, because a lot of people have the idea that they would love to be on an acreage, but I would ask yourself the question, are you willing to clear your driveway early in the morning or late at night? Are you, if you have a green thumb naturally, great, but are you in love with the idea of being on an acreage, or do you actually love going and looking at acreages and living there? There are some people that live in town that like the idea of living on an acreage, but once they get there, they have that kind of feedback of, oh, I can't get pizza. Oh, I gotta drive so far to the grocery store. That comes with the territory. I got news for you.
Right.
So yeah, I would just really examine your own heart and your own self to say, okay, is this something that I want to do for my family because I like the idea of it, or because I actually really want to?
Right. There is a little bit more work involved, especially once those city services come down to you taking care of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all of the questions I have. If you don't have anything else to add, thank you for joining me, and I'll let you go hang out with your kiddos again and enjoy your day.
Of course. Yeah. I think the only thing I haven't said is I'm part of Remax Elite. That's one other thing I guess you can look for in a realtor is, are they part of a brokerage that has a good brand behind them and a high producing brokerage itself. From a professional standpoint, I mean, I have a great management team in my corner and that kind of stuff. So not to say that small boutique brokerages can't be great, because there are great owners and great people within those companies, but just having someone who has a brokerage who has a track record behind them, I think can be important too. So, but overall, I mean, acreages are great. I love them. We plan on actually looking at getting some place soon, so we're thinking about it again too.
Nice.
But yeah, other than that, Megan, thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Yeah, this was good. And it's awesome that you have acreage experience yourself, buying and selling. And I think that helps too if you're looking for a realtor.
Yeah.
So where do people find you?
Well, you can email me at parkerparker@remax.net. Just parkerparker@remax.net. Yeah, as you can probably tell, my name is actually Michael Parker, but no one calls me Michael. So even my signs say Parker Parker. And you can reach out to my brokerage itself to get a hold of me at 780-406-4000. Or is it okay if I even say my cell phone?
If you want.
It's the easiest way to get a hold of me, just 780-216-2010. That's me. Or look me up on social media. You'll find me.
Yeah, you have some really cool stories on social media. So
Yep.
I encourage people to check it out.
Oh, sure.
Awesome. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Megan. You too.
Yeah.
Good to see you.